Welcome to this week's presentations, everybody. Today we're going to be focusing on the biological beginnings of individuals after birth. So we're actually going to be starting at looking at an individual right after they're born and seeing kind of the whole growth process and the change that actually occurs. Now, just a forewarning for all of you that aren't real comfortable with biology, aren't real comfortable with anatomy, please, if you need to, take the time to pause and really get this material. So if there's a slide that's confusing or there's something that you need to review again, don't hesitate to go back over the slide multiple times to get it, and don't hesitate to go into the book and reference topics and ideas that might be a little confusing to you. But as I mentioned, we're going to be starting with birth and kind of moving on from what happens to the body after that. What we see when looking at development after birth is that even though all of us have a lot of the ability to become the adults that we actually are, physically, newborns are very, very different from adults. One of the most noticeable and obvious things that we see with newborns is the fact that they're much smaller than adults. But in addition to having that much smaller size, there's a number of other physical features that we can identify that make infants unique to adults. And this is not only typical in human beings, but it's also typical in a number of other species as well. One of the hallmarks we see with newborns, and something that we don't often recognize, but it's very recognizable if you actually measure this, is a huge imbalance in dimensions. In particular, the dimensions of the head with respect to the rest of the body. And if you look down below, you'll see a bunch of slides that show growth at different times, and it shows the percentage of the body that the head actually occupies. For newborns, the head's about a quarter of the size and weight of the human body. As we age, as we grow, we get to a point where our head is only about an eighth the size of our body, and that change is because our body continues to grow long after birth, and our head is only growing slightly after that point. We also have some dimensions within our extremities, so the balance of our legs and our arms also changes. Those proportions are constantly altering as well. And as we develop physically, that change in balanced dimensions is one of the key things that are actually happening to us. But in addition to changing our proportions, growing larger, there's other more internal changes that happen as well. So if we look at people's brains, their muscle mass, their bone systems, their circulatory systems, all of these areas are extremely underdeveloped at birth. And until we get the connections formed, a lot of basic functioning is very difficult for newborns. So another major part of the developmental process is that development of our nervous system and our physical system that allows us to interact in a way that we would like to interact with our world, or at least in a way that allows us to interact with our world efficiently. A fourth major thing that we see with newborns that makes them different from adults is that their chemistry, in particular their hormones and the concentration of specific neurons that we call, specific chemicals actually that are produced by neurons that we call neurotransmitters, is very different. So they possess much fewer hormones and much fewer neurotransmitters at birth. And until those systems really differentiate themselves and really grow, there's a stark contrast in the internal makings of a newborn and a young child all the way up into adulthood until we get a semi-consistent balance of those neurotransmitters and hormones within the individual. And because of this kind of peculiar size, this lack of balance, this lack of coordination within, there's a lot of inability for young newborns to actually interact with their environment. So as we grow, as we become more physically capable, we actually have the ability to control and interact with our environment much more effectively. And what we're going to study today is how that growth actually takes place. When we look at this growth, when we look at this biological change that happens within the individual, what developmental psychologists and biologists often find is that even though each of us has a slightly different path, so we walk at different days, We say our first words at different days. We do all of these different features and physical abilities that we'll talk about throughout this class at slightly different times. The path that we follow is somewhat similar. That means most of us probably weren't running before we were capable of standing. And most of us weren't, saying our first words at the age of 10. Most of us follow a very simple pattern in terms of time and in terms of order of how we develop physically. And because we see that in most individuals, we can study predictable patterns of growth and also identify when somebody's not following that predictable pattern of growth in an attempt to diagnose what might be going wrong with that individual. But when we're talking about these predictable patterns of growth, we're looking at two major forms of growth. We've got the basic physical development, so that's changes in size, proportion of limbs and head, and also the content of our bodies, so different organs that might emerge, in particular sexual reproductive organs that gain, or I guess change in structure over time. But we also not only have this physical development, but we have another type of development in our brain and nervous system. And in today's class, what we're going to do is split this up into two different sections. So in the past two classes, we actually had three different sections, but we're going to narrow it down in this class to two different sections. The first one is going to focus on physical development, and the second section will look at brain and nervous system development. When focusing in on physical development, I felt it was best to start at the beginning, in particular at birth, because what we'd like to do is understand exactly what we're starting out with. Well, at birth, most newborns are born between 18 to 22 inches and weigh roughly between 6 and 10 pounds. Now, this is typical for most babies. In the United States, it's typical for about 95% of infants. In other countries, especially ones with less nutritional capabilities and ones that have different problems within their system, that percentage drops dramatically. But in most developed countries, around 95% of children fit within the dimensions in both height and weight that we see in the United States. Now, when exceptions occur, what we often have the ability to do is identify where those problems might have come from. And what researchers over the years have found is that there's a couple very specific causes to abnormalities within the height and weight range. One of the big things that we see, even though it's not quite as common as some of the other ones, is the genetics. So having improper genetic codes, having specific problems with our gene combinations can sometimes trigger imbalances in that height and weight at birth. However, these genetic problems aren't nearly as common as the other two major causes to these defects in size and weight. One of the major causes to these defects is premature births. In particular, if a child doesn't go through the entire gestation period, if they're not in the mother's womb for long enough, very often those children are born at a weight that's much lower than would be anticipated. In some rare instances, when a child's in the mother's womb for too long, they're slightly above the weight scale, but the more severe problems are when a child has been born a month to 2 months too early. And in that case, as you can see in a picture on the right, you get premature infants, and the child on the left in that picture is an example of what most people refer to as a preemie, a premature child. And this child, I believe, was born about 3 months early, and you can see a noticeable difference between that child and another child that was born just near on time. And those differences cause not only structural changes in size and weight, but often carries over to other problems as a child develops. And we'll talk about those problems as we move on with these slides. But in addition to having premature births, there's another major cause to specific developmental problems, or I guess abnormalities in the height and weight of children. And these deal with prenatal problems, things that happen before the birth. Some of them are more traumatic. So if the mother went through an accident or fell or had some trauma to the child, or there was something with the birthing process that impacted the child, you can see some differences in the child's size and weight at that point. But other things can often occur even before that. So teratogens, some of those blood problems that we talked about earlier, exposure to specific things within the environment, mercury, other things that we've kind of seen in the text and in the last class, can all have an impact on the weight of a child. Mother's diet, and in particular whether or not the mother smokes, has also been linked to birth weight problems. Most of the time when we're looking at birth weight abnormalities, though, we're talking about births that are underweight, so children that don't fit up to those requirements, so children that are born below 18 inches and below 5 pounds. But on some rare instances, in particular with the mother's diet, we can see moments where children are actually much heavier than they should be, so around 15 pounds. And that's primarily a product of genetics and the mother's diet, very often, even though there's some other exceptions as well. After birth, no matter who you are or what weight you were born, what we typically do in the developmental process is grow rapidly. In fact, for the first 2 years of our lives, the age that we're going to label as called infancy throughout the semester, we see a dramatic physical growth within the individual. Most of us within 2 years will weigh 2.5 to 5 times greater than we did at birth. So if you were born at 10 pounds, within the age of 2, or by the age of 2, you should weigh somewhere around 25 to 50 pounds. That's a dramatic change in weight. That's a huge, huge bump up. If you were a little bit lighter, you're still going to weigh roughly 2.5 to 5 times greater. And that change in weight is followed by other changes as well. So you get 1.5 to 2 times taller than you originally were. So if you were born at 10 inches or 12 inches tall, you will essentially be, if you were growing twice as much, around 2 feet tall. But most of us, when we're born around 16 to 20 inches. So at 20 inches, we would be almost 3 feet tall by the time we've reached the age of 2. And that's a massive amount of growth in height as well. Our muscle mass is also increasing, which means we're gaining more muscle, we're gaining the ability to control our limbs, and all of this physical development, this rapid physical development, happens in the first 2 years. After the first 2 years, we reach a stage of development called early childhood, where we still see increases in weight and height, and a little bit of an increase in muscle mass, but it's not nearly as common, and it's not nearly as pronounced as we see in infancy. In fact, once we reach early childhood, our changes start to really be influenced by our environment. And what we often see around the age of 2 to 6 is that children start to become very differentiated from each other. So some children are much taller than others, some are much more heavy than others, some are much more skinny. And all of these variations in fat, muscle, height, and weight content are a product of the environment, are a product of what the child experiences. Genes do play a role in this, but a lot of times what we see is based on your early childhood experiences, your exposure to things. Your body starts to take a very different form from those of your siblings or your peers that are in the same age range. So seeing those differences, being able to recognize those differences, and seeing kind of this particular change in growth for specific individuals is really the hallmark of the early childhood period. And what we also see is that even though there's differentiations, when there's extreme cases, in particular in this early childhood period, usually these things can be linked to specific causes. So diet, in both ways, malnourishment and overeating, can have a huge impact on a child in early childhood. And we also see that physical ailments, things that the child might be experiencing at that age, between the age of 2 to 6, could also have an impact on the growth of a child. But other things, ones that we might not expect having an impact on this growth, can also be related to things that actually happened before birth. So a number of studies have shown that prenatal experience, exposure to smoking or stresses before birth, can actually have an impact on the growth of a child between the ages of 2 and 6. And those effects have been very surprising to a number of developmental psychologists, and it speaks even louder to the need for mothers to have proper diet and nutrition when they're carrying their children. One final thing that can also impact the height and the weight of the child and whether or not they grow in a normal or at least typical pattern is in a specific gene or a specific hormone that we have within our systems called a growth hormone. And this substance is produced in a gland that we call the pituitary gland. And for individuals who have a problem with this, either a tumor or some stress that actually impacts this pituitary gland, what we see is them developing a specific disorder that we call growth hormone deficiency. And essentially it's an absence of that growth hormone being produced by the pituitary gland, and this has a huge impact on the physical development of children at this age and for very often the rest of their lives. If we look closer at growth hormone deficiency, what we see in individuals is not only are they smaller than other individuals, but a lot of other things change as well. So if you look in the center, you can see the pituitary gland, which is responsible for producing that. But if growth hormone deficiency does happen, what happens to the individuals, not only do they not grow very fast at that age, but they don't really grow that much throughout their entire lives. And when they do grow, what we often see is kind of an imbalance in proportions that we typically see in other individuals. So they look like adults, very often people with this particular problem, but their dimensions aren't 100% correct. So their head is much larger than the rest of their body. Oftentimes their arms aren't quite in proportion to their hips that we would usually see in other individuals. And this imbalance not only happens at this age, but really remains for most of people's lives if they experience this particular deficiency. However, GHD, or growth hormone deficiency, typically isn't the cause of variations in size and weight in individuals. It's the teratogens, it's the experiences, it's the diet that typically shapes the individual that we are as we're growing up in this early childhood stage. After reaching early childhood and getting through it and reaching the age of 6, we go into our middle and late childhood stages. And what we see in middle and late childhood stage is almost a drop or a decline in growth and height. So there's almost zero height and zero weight growth in these individuals. Instead, what we often see in middle and late childhood is more of a change in dimensions. So children start to have their body kind of accommodate with their heads, so they are able to kind of balance better, they're able to support their own weight much better between the ages of 6 to 11. And we also see a change in the structure within the body. So their muscle mass of children gets much greater, their bone development gets much stronger, so they're able to actually support their own weight, coordinate themselves much better. And what we see within this period isn't as much the massive physical growth as the massive transition from kind of a helpless infant or helpless child into an individual that's actually able to interact with their environment in a way that allows them to get what they actually need. So even though we don't have that rapid physical growth anymore in middle and late childhood, we actually have physical growth that's really essential for an individual to be able to interact with their environment. After middle to late childhood, we go through a process of change called puberty. Now, puberty can onset at a number of different times. It happens to occur most of the time for individuals between the ages of 9 to 11, but there are variations to that. And once we start puberty, usually it lasts somewhere between 6 to 8 years, which means for most people, puberty typically ends at around the ages of 15 to 17. When we look at what's marked by puberty, what we see in individuals is a massive amount of physical change that's due specifically to an alteration within an individual's internal system. In particular, what we see is a dramatic increase in chemicals that we call hormones. These particular chemicals that are linked to puberty are secreted by the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, which are two internal systems that we'll look at in the second half of this section. But those two systems, the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, are responsible for producing two specific hormones that are very strongly linked to puberty. Those two hormones are estradiol and testosterone. And what we see with estradiol and testosterone is that after puberty, or once the onset of puberty actually occurs, both males and females rapidly increase the production of these two particular hormones. Now, before taking this class, a large number of you might have mistakenly thought that only males produced testosterone and only females produced estradiol in puberty. But what we've seen in a number of studies is that actually in both males and females, there's an increase in both of these hormones at puberty. The major difference is when these hormones are actually introduced into the system and how much increase in the hormones actually occurs. For women, usually puberty occurs a little bit earlier, so around the ages of 9 to 10. But for some women, this might occur even earlier. But for women, when these increases in hormones occur, when these changes in physical development associated with these increases in hormone occur, what we see is a much more gradual process of change. So even though it happens earlier, those changes aren't nearly as dramatic because they seem to draw out a little bit longer than what we see with males. Their estradiol levels do increase much more than their testosterone levels, but there is a 2 times increase in testosterone in females. For males, they go through puberty usually around the ages of 10 to 11, maybe even 11 to 12. And these changes are much, much more dramatic when a male goes through puberty. So their testosterone levels don't only double, they actually multiply by 8 times. So a male's pituitary gland in particular and their hypothalamus are producing 8 times more testosterone than they were before they went through puberty. There's also a small increase, though, in males in estradiol as well, and this has an impact on reproductive abilities, but it also has an impact on some physical characteristics as well. Obviously, when we think of puberty, most of us link that not only to the physical change, the increase in hormones, but also the ability to reproduce. So for females, you very often during puberty will have your first period, and for males, you start to be able to actually reproduce. So you start to produce semen, and you actually have the ability, through those processes of meiosis, to be able to create another individual. But reproductive growth is only one of many changes that actually occurs during puberty. One thing we see is that both men and women get a little bit taller, or much taller depending upon the individual, and much heavier. In particular, what we see with men is that there's a dramatic increase in muscle mass and bone density. For females, what we often see is an increase in fat deposits, and these fat deposits are believed to be linked to those reproductive abilities. But those fat deposits typically occur in very specific places. So around the hips and the legs and in the breasts are some of the more typical areas for these fat deposits to increase. In addition to these height and weight changes and reproductive abilities, though, we also see very different changes within the individual linked to puberty. So some of the more typical changes that we see in individuals are changes in voice, more pronounced in males and females, but sometimes females have a slight change in their voice as well. Changes in breast size in both males and females, but obviously a little bit more pronounced in females than males, or at least in most females than males. We also see increases in hair in a number of different areas for both males and females. Changes in skin and structure. So acne is something that's very often paired with puberty, but there's other things that happen to the skin at this puberty stage. And dramatic changes in the skeletal system as well. For females, These changes are often linked to reproductive abilities, but for males, the skeletal system changes also occur to kind of accommodate for those increases in muscle mass and just a changing into an adulthood. Now, for most individuals, as we said earlier, puberty occurs between the ages of 9 to 15 or 11 to 17. But for a small sample of individuals, this puberty can actually occur a little bit earlier. And what we've found over time, over centuries of studies on puberty, is that it seems to be occurring earlier and earlier for a large number of individuals. And this trend, this change, has been something scientists have been trying to understand for a long time. And currently, what we believe is actually going on is that this change in puberty, the onset of puberty, is something that's directly linked to the environment. In particular, what we see is that even though puberty changes us through internal changes within the individual, external factors, so things that are going on in the environment, might be the cause of those internal changes. So things like diet, stress, and other external stimuli that we're exposed to might very well be the cause or the trigger of these emotional rushes that we get from our hypothalamus and our pituitary gland. Because of that, what we've started to try to do is really pinpoint those things that might actually onset puberty at different times for different individuals. One of the major reasons why we're trying to understand why this actually happens, or why puberty might be onset through early development, is because when people experience puberty much earlier than others, there's a number of both physical and psychological tools that this early puberty can actually take. When an individual experiences puberty much earlier than their peers, or what we define this puberty as is something called precocious puberty. So it's a very early onset and a very rapid progression of puberty within these individuals. And precocious puberty definitely happens for a large number of individuals, but it happens much more often in girls than boys. So women are 10 times more likely in today's society to actually experience precocious puberty than boys. And when we're talking about precocious puberty, we're talking about the onset of puberty before the ages of 9. So 8, 9 years old is when typically we see precocious puberty. And with precocious puberty, in particular with girls, we see a lot of negative impacts. So girls that experience precocious puberty not only are picked on more often by their peers and experience a lot of stress, but they start to change their behavior as well. So women who experience precocious puberty, even if they didn't do it before they experienced puberty, tend to display much riskier behaviors. They also become much more emotionally unstable and have a lot more social problems after experiencing precocious puberty. And it's not just at that stage in development, it actually carries over to the rest of their lives. And when we look at the future, what we see a lot of times is much poorer school performance, much, more risky life choices in these individuals, and much more time spent doing things that are a little bit beyond their age. So these children who experience precocious puberty tend to use drugs much earlier than their peers, are exposed to alcohol much earlier than their peers, are exposed to sexual activity much earlier than their peers, and oftentimes tend to affiliate with older individuals much more than their peers who haven't experienced precocious puberty. For boys, even though it has some what we would expect to be negative impacts, we don't see nearly as much of a dramatic experience for these children. For boys, even though precocious puberty might be something that's desired, it's definitely not nearly as negative as it is for girls. So because we know that precocious puberty is something that can be very traumatic, finding those cues, those triggers to puberty, is something a lot of developmental psychologists and biologists are interested in studying. After puberty, we reach kind of the next major stage of development. In our mid-20s, once we reach early adulthood, we do have a continual growth, but this growth is much, much slower, and there's not as many changes in the body. But after our 20s, in particular when we get into somewhere around 25 years of age, our body starts to decline. This decline isn't very rapid, so if any of you are 25, 26 years of age, you don't have to worry, you're not going to fall apart within a few weeks. But we do see that about the age of 25, maybe 30 for some individuals, that there are some declining changes within the body. One of the big things that's linked to this change is extra collections of fat. So we typically have more fat collecting in our stomach and in our chest and in our back for some individuals and in our hips. And these fat collections usually increase much more as we age. We also, believe it or not, after the age of 25, start to shrink. Now, this shrink isn't rapid. You're not going to become 6 inches shorter when you're older, but you will shrink about 1 inch from the age of 25 to 75 if you're a male, and women will shrink about 2 inches from the ages of 25 to 75. We also, in addition to gaining fat and shrinking, lose fat under our skin. So those fat molecules kind of disappear from our skin, move to our stomach, and that loss is what actually causes wrinkles. Our skin also loses its elasticity, and there's also, when we get to much, much older age, there's also things where we have spots or colorations within our skin. And our muscle mass after the age of 25 actually starts to decrease as we age. This is called sarcopenia. And these muscles not only decline, but they also lose their elasticity. And our bone strength and density also decreases. But before you start worrying about this, before you start getting very scared, understand this is a very, very gradual experience. And in fact, a number of studies have shown that if people are exposed to the right physical environments and the right challenges, a lot of these changes, a lot of these decays can actually be lessened and prolonged for a much longer period of time. So even though all of us will go through this path, based on your experience, based on your environment, these changes can happen at different rates. After we reach about the age of 50, so once we get into much later adulthood, what we see is some dramatic changes in very specific physical aspects. For females, the big thing that happens after about the age of 50 is an experience called menopause. The menopause is when a female no longer becomes, or I guess loses the ability to be reproductively capable. And this loss of reproductive abilities is also linked to other biological changes. So there's a dramatic change in bone density and muscle density that's often accompanying these changes in reproductive abilities. But in addition to that, chemical changes also occur. So estrogen levels drop, and this causes a lot of physical ailments as well. So a very typical experience that's linked to menopause is something called hot flashes, where females tend to feel very, very hot for momentary periods of time. Fatigue and nausea are also linked to these biological changes in menopause, and a number of other more individually specific changes also very often take place in individuals experiencing menopause. After these changes occur from females, we also see a lot of changes in physical appearance as well. And this actually happens for males as well. So even though there's a very gradual decline up to about the age of 50 or 60 in our physical appearance and our changes, after about the age of 50, we see a huge transition into different features. So our skin becomes much more wrinkled, our dimensions of our face can actually change much more rapidly, and all of these changes are linked to those older ages. In addition to having these physical changes in appearance, we also have physical changes within our body as well. So our cholesterol levels tend to get higher, our circulatory systems tend to decline, our muscular systems and our skeletal systems definitely decline, and oftentimes our lungs lose a lot of their elasticity and the ability for us to be able to really take a deep breath and be able to exhaust ourselves at the same exact level. Now, just like before though, when we look at how these changes take place and the pattern of these changes, what we often see is that if an individual exercises regularly, if they're exposed to specific challenges, a lot of these physical declines can be offset. So they can be slowed down for a very long period of time if a person remains active and challenged. And because of that, a number of individuals within the healthcare system and within the psychological community have pushed for finding ways to continue to challenge individuals when they reach this old age. That sums up what we're going to be talking about today for physical change and development, but we're only halfway done with today's class. In the next section, what we're going to do is focus on changes within our nervous system, so within our brain and the rest of our nervous system that's responsible for our ability to coordinate all the movement that we're actually capable of doing. So if you can, take a break, relax, maybe take a nap if you need to, come back and we'll go over these neurological changes that happen at the same time as our physical changes.